Welcome to Psychology Ninjas. Today it's the turn of agency theory, one of our theories of obedience. Okay, so when I'm explaining agency theory, what do? Well, it's a theory, which means that we need to talk about the key terms. We recommend 4 key terms for the 4 AO1 marks available in these questions. Most students accurately explain autonomous state and agentic shift. However, what we need to make sure we do is talk about those in relation to obedience. That in an autonomous state, we're less likely to be obedient because we feel responsible for the actions. When we shift into an agentic state, we are more likely to obey because the authority figure is taking responsibility for the behaviour and any consequences. Most students often forget to explain moral strain and binding factors. When we're talking about moral strain, if we're feeling fancy, we can use the term cognitive dissonance. This means that there's a disconnect between the causing harm and our moral compass, and that we feel a sense of conflict about that. In order to reduce moral strain, we have binding factors. These are things that connect us to the group, ensuring our obedience. Okay, so then we want to move into evaluation, and we are focusing on a SODA structure because this is a theory. This breaks down into supporting research, opposing this explanation, giving a different theory, and when we do that, we need to explain why that different theory is a better explanation. In this case, we're going to use social impact theory as our other theory of obedience, and then looking at application. Okay, so when we're thinking about this, in each of these paragraphs, we want to give arguments for and against, ensuring that we give those logical chains of reasoning. So if we think about this in relation to our 8-mark question, we've got the command word evaluate. We know that that is a sneaky command word and we need to explain agency theory rather than just giving strengths and weaknesses. We recommend that you take an integrated approach. So you would explain what the autonomous state is and say that there's research to support that when you are in a more autonomous state, you are less likely to be obedient. That research support comes from Milgram's experiment 10. You could just use Milgram's rundown office study. That's fine as well. What we want to be doing here is comparing the levels of obedience and saying that there's less obedience in the rundown office study because we're more likely to be in an autonomous state because the environment doesn't link into the legitimate authority of the researcher. We're going to counter that with the fact that Perry says that participants questioned whether the shocks were real, and that reduces the validity of agency theory as an explanation. That because the supporting research isn't quite accurate, the theory itself isn't accurate. We'd then move into explaining the agentic shift, but say that this concept lacks reliability. We have other research from Rank and Jacobson that say that although there were legitimate authority figures and people were in an agentic state, the nurses still failed to obey the doctor. We can counter that once again by saying, however, there is research to support the fact that communicating via the telephone does decrease obedience. And here we can talk about the experiment 7 and again compare that to baseline. What we're going to talk about here is that extraneous variables may well affect the agentic shift and whether we are likely to take responsibility for our own behaviour. We're then going to talk about moral strain, explaining this theory and then giving some evaluation. Here we're going to say that agency theory is reductionist and there are other explanations of obedience, focusing in on social impact theory. This is a better explanation because it gives us a clear formula in which to use. We can then talk about it explains the divisional effect, that when we manipulate the number of sources and targets, we can manipulate the level of obedience. This theory is a more valid and accurate explanation of obedience because it takes into account more variables. Finally, we talk about binding factors and then link it into application. We can use binding factors in the real world, and these are employed within the military by talking about either collateral damage in order to mitigate moral strain, or that you're not fighting for yourself, you're fighting for the person next to you to give your best. We can counteract this by saying that actually this idea of binding factors can have a negative impact on society, explaining the human rights abuses in Abu Ghraib by the American military in Iraq. We can say that this theory then has credibility because it explains why real-life events occur. Let's now have a look at some exam questions. Here we have a discuss question. This is quite a unique command word within Edexcel. It requires you to explain something and in this case, it's agency theory. It then requires you to apply agency theory to the scenario, in this case that of Mrs. Duncan, who's recently taken over her class. We've got this idea about obedience here and that students don't follow instructions, and we want to improve the situation for Mrs. Duncan. Let's have a look at another exam question. Quite a lot of elements are here in this question, so let's break them down. We've got the command word explain, which asks us to go a bit beyond what we would do in a state, so we need more than just a single sentence. Because we've got a stem here, that explanation does need to be tied into the information in that stem. We're focusing here on strengths and the strength of agency theory, but we need to place that in the context of the manager of a local youth club. We get 1 mark for our identification in context of a strength, and a second mark for justifying that with a link to either generalisability, reliability or validity. Thanks for joining us today here at Psychology Ninjas. Don't forget to like, subscribe and hit that bell. See you next time.